Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see such a big crowd here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Cadogan Hall. I'm Flora Willson, and I'm really delighted to be here with you this evening for this pre-performance talk, and indeed for this Donizetti and Friends recital from Opera Rara. Sitting with me to my left is Roger Parker, opera scholar extraordinaire, and of course Opera Rara's repertoire consultant. Most important for this evening, he is the driving force behind Opera Rara's Donizetti song project. Roger, I feel as though we may have had quite a lot of conversations by now about the Donizetti song project. Some of you may even have heard them as part of our Lives in Song series. Could you perhaps fill in the basics for anyone who has escaped thus far hearing you explain what the Donizetti song project is?
Well, yeah, it started as a as a kind of lockdown project between me and a colleague, Ian Schofield, who's also here in the audience. And we just thought, well, we've got to do something. So Donizetti, I knew, because I'd been working on him most of my life, wrote at least 200 solo songs.
So you actually knew at that point that he had written all these songs and they just weren't known to the rest of us?
Well, there was a catalogue which we knew was very full of mistakes and quite unreliable. But it suggested there were around 200. And in the end, as it turned out, 5 years later, there were actually about 200 solo songs, but not the 200 that the catalogue had listed. Many of those were duplicates and so on, but we discovered a lot more songs. And it's the gift that goes on taking, in a sense. Just in the last couple of weeks, Ian and I have been working on a new song that we discovered that we could make sense of only just recently. So this business of discovery has been, for me, I said I've been working on Donizetti all my life, or most of my life, but actually working on these songs has made me understand something completely different about the composer. So it's been an incredibly exciting experience.
Just tell us a tiny bit about what state these sources are in. When we say you've been finding these things, what have you actually been finding? What have you been having to make sense of?
Yeah, I mean, I would say about half of the songs were published in the 19th century, and sometimes published multiply, sometimes in different languages, and it's a question of working out which of those published versions is the one that's most reliable. And then another half of them are just present in manuscript copies, sometimes in the composer's hand, and sometimes not. And those are much more problematic because you have to work out whether they're actually by Donizetti. You have to decipher his handwriting.
Which isn't always the clearest.
Well, you edited
I was going to say, I seem to remember,
well,
yeah.
So that proved very difficult. Also, what's very complicated with these songs is that basically they were social capital for Donizetti. He would write a song, go to someone's house for the evening, and the daughter of the house would sing the song, and he'd give them the manuscript, and then it disappeared forever. So the manuscripts, his individual manuscripts, tend to be scattered all over the place. If he went to someone else's house the week after and wanted to write that song again, he would literally write it out again, and it's always different. So in some cases, we have 4 or 5 different versions of the same song, which is remarkable. That he didn't, I mean, I think he wasn't deliberately making them different. It's just that he'd given away the manuscript, so he didn't have it anymore. So he made up another song with those same words. So the whole business of finding them has been actually sort of really consuming as an interest and incredibly exciting.
So we've now got these 200 odd songs, thanks to you and that work that you've been doing. As you say, you've been working on Donizetti as a researcher for decades at this point. I won't stress that too much, because in case I made you feel sensitive about it. But for a long time, how is this changing your sense of Donizetti as a composer, to actually shift from thinking of him as an opera composer, above all, as so many of us know him, to a person who also wrote a lot of songs?
Yeah, I think the basic thing about the thing that may seem surprising is that the vast majority of these songs have nothing to do with opera. They are not sketches for operatic arias or anything like that. They're quite different in all sorts of ways. There are songs, an opera aria will have to make its impact in 5 or 6 minutes. A song will usually make its impact in 2 minutes, sometimes 1 minute. So it's a much more economical genre. And what it brings out, I think, is fundamentally Donizetti's European kind of focus, that he's not just an Italian opera composer, and that his music is something which is worth thinking about in the context of larger European developments. So it makes, many of you here will happily exist in this ghetto, which is Italian opera, but there tends to be a place where Italian opera is thought of. And this makes it quite clear that Donizetti was, well, he partook of European Romanticism, and that a lot of these songs, if they weren't in Italian, if a lot of them are in French, if they were in German or something, you would immediately associate them with German or French composers. He has a European style when he's writing these. And so, in a sense, it broadened out the aspect, and I think that's very clear from tonight's programme.
Well, let's talk a bit about that programme. So we obviously have various songs of Donizetti's on this programme. Let's think about those first. There are probably too many to talk about individually, but are there any particular things, any particular songs you think we should be listening out for?
I think the way we've organised the programme, which is, I think works very well, is that each half will begin with a number of short Donizetti songs, and you'll get an idea of the range of the songs from that. And then there are some songs by Berlioz. We'll talk about those in a minute. And then the other singer, the singer who hasn't sung so far, will come on and sing one of Donizetti's longest songs. In the case of the tenor, this is about a poor, an apprentice monk who is assailed by thoughts from the devil on the night before he commits to his calling. And for the mezzo-soprano, it's a wild fantasy about a woman who believes that she can save Napoleon and bring him back into the European mainstream from St. Helena.
As we were saying, European Romanticism, which we don't tend to think happened in Italy, but there we have Donizetti.
Yeah. And these are from his Parisian years, but actually probably, I think it's quite difficult to work out, but they were probably actually written in Italy before he left for Paris in 1838. So they're a kind of they're written by the poetry is written by the same person, and they're kind of matching songs, but they're both about 12 minutes long, so they're very large. They're almost cantatas, if you want, and those centerpieces of both halves give you, I think, the extent of Donizetti's kind of fantasy as far as these are concerned.
One of the things that we've talked about quite a lot around the Donizetti Song Project is that actually some of these songs are now having their modern first performances, effectively. They've not been heard for hundreds of years. Yeah. Is that the case for any of the songs on tonight's programme?
Yes, it is. For instance, O ne me chasse pas, which Michael will be singing as part of that. It's, I don't think it's ever been heard in public before. It was in a book of songs which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale, not catalogued as by Donizetti, so it turned up, not discovered by me, actually discovered by Alexander Weatherson, who was the chairman of the Donizetti Society. A wonderful piece of music, actually, that was just completely unknown before that time. So, and there are a number of those. It's very difficult. I mean, almost all of these songs, I think, are unusual. I doubt whether many of you have heard many of them before, but some of them have simply not been performed since the 19th century.
Remarkable. Berlioz, then. Let's think about this. Yes. Other composers are available.
He's the one with the hair, isn't he?
Exactly, the hair. It's actually not unlike mine. He was 6 years younger than Donizetti, of course, French rather than Italian. Again, we're going to hear a mix of shorter songs and longer scenes. Again, what stands out for you on this programme?
Yeah, I thought, I mean, one of the projects with the Donizetti song project has been to introduce Donizetti into this wider kind of European space. And one of the ways we've been doing this is by programming Donizetti songs along with other songs by other composers. So you can get an idea of the kind of range. And they're usually called Donizetti and Friends. To call Berlioz and Donizetti friends would be stretching it enormously. And I wrote about that in the program. Berlioz, well, Donizetti said at one point, oh, Berlioz is someone who is a music critic because he's failed as a composer, and the only music he likes is Beethoven's and his own. To some extent, I think he was sort of right about that. Well, Gluck, he liked Gluck as well. But Berlioz was a sort of savage detractor of Italian opera in the first years of his life. And there are complicated reasons for that, I think, some of which I explored in the program essay. But one of the interesting things about Berlioz is that as he gets older, he begins to be more confronted with the European Donizetti, particularly when Donizetti wrote French language operas, and gradually changed his view. So they were antagonists, but eventually sort of came together a little bit. But the interesting thing, I think, is to hear Berlioz straight after Donizetti and see what you think about it, see what you think the main differences are and similarities between the two.
Because we do tend to think of them in very different ways, where Berlioz's innovations essentially were harmonic, all those weird harmonies that he uses, whereas we think of Donizetti very much as a kind of lyrical composer.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I think you'll immediately see one of the things that's different about the songs is that immediately in the Berlioz songs, the piano has more to do. The piano is more important. It's a more important carrier of meaning, if you want. It's very odd piano writing, extremely odd piano writing. Berlioz famously was an even worse pianist than I am, and didn't really understand or didn't care to understand the piano very much. So the piano is written in very strange registers a lot of the time, but it's a real carrier of meaning. While with Donizetti, it tends to be the emphasis much more on the voice. But in terms of harmonic writing, actually, most of these songs of Donizetti's, which you're going to hear, are in French, and they're late in his life. In terms of harmony, I think you'll find that the sort of chromatic language of both composers is quite similar in all sorts of ways. So there are differences. Also, Berlioz, these songs that Michael and Marie-Nicole are going to sing are at the melodic end of what Berlioz writes anyway. So there's a lot of lyricism in there. I think you'll find that there are a lot of interesting similarities between the two. That was the impression, I think, to try and make us listen to Berlioz in a different way and also Donizetti in a different way.
Did they actually know each other? Do we know? I realise I haven't come across any evidence, but do you know?
They must have done. I don't think there's any direct evidence. They had, and again, I talk about it in the program, they had a tremendous kind of polemical exchange at one point. And later in life, Donizetti, in 1846, just before he went into his final decline, Donizetti actually wrote a letter of introduction for Berlioz. A slightly oddly worded one, it has to be said, where something like, you will judge the quality of the music for yourself, or something like that. You know.
Not a ringing endorsement then.
Not a 5-star. But they must have known each other. I mean, Paris in the 1840s was a relatively small world, and they must have been at the same performances and so on, and also at the same private salons.
Well, let's talk briefly about Paris in the 1840s. After all, you know, a rivalry of this kind only really makes sense in a particular context. And it's very striking that Berlioz essentially was rooted in Paris ever since he moved there as a student to go to medical school. Donizetti, by contrast, ended up there repeatedly for productions, but then moved there. Was it with the intention of it being a permanent move
Yeah.
in 1838.
Yeah.
And sort of arrived later then.
Yeah.
Remind us, what had driven Donizetti from Italy at that point?
I think his wife had died in 1837, and I think he was just wretchedly depressed and wanted to forget about that part of his life. That's one reason. Another reason is financial. You went to Paris, you could make a lot more money there than you could in Italy. So there were various reasons. Also, famously, Rossini had been there before him. But I think that the interesting thing about Paris in the 1840s in this sense is one thing that Paris is famous for at this period is its cosmopolitanism, the fact that Donizetti could have a career there, and various composers from all over Europe ended up in Paris. Wagner was there at exactly the same time. There were all sorts of composers who came to Paris. And Donizetti is an obvious example of this cosmopolitanism, that he kind of transposed himself into a French atmosphere with quite a lot of ease. The interesting thing is that, if anything, I think Berlioz is a kind of was a contrary force with that cosmopolitanism. Berlioz famously did not like the influence on French music of foreign styles. And this is one of the reasons he was so anti-Donizetti originally. And he has this kind of quirky, Berlioz has this kind of quirky genealogy where he says he belongs to Gluck and Beethoven, kind of thing, which no one would think of, obviously. And there is some way in which Berlioz, I think they were at sort of opposite ends of this cosmopolitan pool that was going on.
Berlioz had had such a miserable time in Rome when he won the Prix de Rome on the 4th attempt.
Yeah.
And then he just hated being at the Villa Medici.
Yeah.
He really didn't enjoy being part of that Italian musical culture at all.
Yeah, and I think, the interesting thing about that is that Berlioz, as with everything, wrote a lot about Italy. He wrote a lot about that journey he had there. And it was clear that he had an incredible sort of romantic attachment to the idea of Italy. Any of you know the Trojans will know about that, these cries of Italie, this fabled place where the classics were. And one of the things that he couldn't stomach really when he got to Italy was modernity. He basically saw cities and working people and those things, and that kind of Italy gradually coming into modernity was something which he felt betrayed what Italy was. So there's a very complex kind of view he had of what Italy represented.
The songs by both of these composers that we're going to hear tonight, where did they fit into Paris's musical ecosystem at this time? Because we know plenty about the opera houses in Paris, the best in the world in lots of ways, the most highly funded and best supported. But where did these songs fit in?
Yeah, they're mostly not, if there's a division between the public and the private, and I think it's actually a problematic division, but the songs are definitely mostly in Salon. There's a very active Salon culture going on there. And most of these songs were written for that. There are some, we know that, for instance, the long song that Marie-Nicole is going to sing about the mad woman on St. Helena, that was performed in concert. And I think both those two long songs would be thought of as concert fare in some way. But most of the shorter songs were for salons. And therefore for, well, you might say private consumption, although I think the division between public and private, the audience was almost exactly the same for both of them, and it was an elite audience. But that's where they belong, basically, in these more intimate atmospheres where there are not huge vocal demands. Often they're relatively simple in their vocal demands in comparison with opera, but they're very intense, the words are very important, and they deliver something to an audience which is no bigger than the one that's here at the moment. So we'll keep everyone else out.
Before we finish, how do you and the performers indeed go about constructing a programme such as this one? These are the kind of behind-the-scenes things that we hear so little about as audience members. But how do you go about putting those songs in that particular order, deciding which songs of the 200 to put into a programme like this?
Well, you can do a fast one, a slow one, and a fast one, or a slow one, and then a fast one. You know, there are some basic things. You don't end with a funereal dirge. You know, there's all sorts of reasons for that. But actually, with these singers and with a lot of the people that we've been working with in these concerts, I think there becomes a kind of emotional journey which gets placed within the choice of songs. So it's complicated. It's to do with the musical style. Keys come into this as well. You don't want sudden, you know, jolts of keys between different songs. So there are all sorts of ways in which these things get decided. It's actually quite interesting. They get decided in a very informal way, and you keep sending a list of songs to singers, and they come back sort of changed around a bit, and then you change them again. And it's a rather strange process, but comes out with something which I think at its best is some kind of story, is a kind of journey that you go through with the individual songs. That it's not just stop, start, that you get a sense of something more continuous going on.
It's interesting you should say that. I hope you won't mind me finishing by asking a slightly more personal question, because as you said earlier, this was a lockdown project for you in the first instance, quite solitary, based in research, and then all that editing time. Of course, over the last year or two, you've been spending time with the singers in studio, recording, actually hearing these songs in concert as well as in recording. How does that feel to hear these songs actually lifted back off the page again?
Yeah, it's a very, very complex emotion, I have to say. It's a very, very complex emotion. You'd think it would be unbridled joy at suddenly hearing them sung by these amazing singers. But they've been in my mind in all sorts of different ways, you know, and when a singer sings it, that fixes it in one position, you know, for that time. And that's rather melancholy for me in some ways. So it's hugely exciting. It's a very complex emotion. I've loved it actually, and I've loved working. I was quite closely involved in the recording sessions of both of these two songs, and it was an amazing experience, exhausting as well, emotionally exhausting as much as anything else. But, you know, yes, when text becomes act, it's a very complicated business, I think, if you've been involved in making the text.
Well, that is, I'm afraid, all we've got time for tonight. But thank you so much all for joining us. Thank you, Roger, for speaking, of course. If this has whetted your appetite for hearing more of Roger talking about Donizetti in conversation with me, as it happens, do look out for Opera Rara's Lives in Song series. It's on YouTube. There'll also be the full series of podcasts released later in the summer on your preferred podcast platform. But for now, of course, we really hope you enjoy this evening's recital. Thank you.